The desert wind carried death that afternoon. James Thornton pulled his horse to a stop, squinting against the dust devils dancing across the abandoned trail. Then he heard it, a sound so faint, so impossible, it made his blood run cold. A tiny voice, barely a whisper. "Mama!" His hand instinctively moved to his revolver. Out here, 20 miles from the nearest settlement, nothing should be alive except rattlesnakes and vultures. The sound came again, weaker this time, from inside a weathered burlap sack lying against the collapsed wall of an old barn. James dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on sun-baked earth. His heart hammered as he approached the sack. It moved, just slightly, but it moved. "God Almighty," he breathed, dropping to his knees. His calloused hands trembled as he loosened the rope binding the sack closed. The smell hit him first, the sour scent of sickness and soiled cloth. Then he saw them, 3 tiny faces, purple-tinged and barely breathing. Newborns, triplets. Their lips were cracked, their skin hot to the touch. One of them, a little girl with wisps of dark hair, opened her mouth again. "Ma, Ma." James Thornton was a man who'd seen death. He'd buried his wife Sarah and their stillborn son just 14 months ago, laid them in the hard Montana ground while his soul turned to stone. He'd sworn never to feel that kind of pain again, never to let anything matter that much. But looking at these 3 dying babies, something cracked inside his chest. Rage flooded through him first, white-hot fury at whoever could do this. Then came something he thought he'd buried with Sarah. Hope. Desperate, terrifying hope. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I've got you now." 24 hours earlier, in the small frontier town of Redemption Creek, a young woman named Catherine Miller had made the hardest decision of her life. The labor had come suddenly, violently, in the back room of the boarding house where she'd been hiding for 3 months. No midwife, no mother to hold her hand. Just Catherine, alone, biting down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. She was 22 years old and had been beautiful once, before shame had hollowed out her cheeks and put shadows under her eyes. The father, a traveling merchant who'd promised her the world, had disappeared the moment she'd told him about the baby. Just one baby, she'd thought then. She hadn't known about the other 2. When the first child came, Catherine had wept with relief. When the second arrived 10 minutes later, she'd felt the first stirrings of panic. When the third baby girl slipped into the world, Catherine had stared at the 3 tiny, squalling infants and felt her mind fracture. 3 mouths to feed, 3 lives depending on her. And she had nothing, no money, no family, no future. Her father, a fire and brimstone preacher, had thrown her out when her condition became visible. "You're dead to us," he'd said, his face hard as granite. Dead and damned. The town had been no kinder. Whispers followed her everywhere. Doors closed in her face. Even the church ladies who preached charity had turned away. Catherine had tried, God knows she'd tried, to find work, to find help. But an unwed mother with 3 infants? In 1883, she might as well have been a leper. So in the darkest hour before dawn, with her body still bleeding and her mind fractured by desperation, Catherine had wrapped her babies in the only clean cloth she had, torn pieces of her own dress. She'd kissed each tiny forehead, whispered a prayer she didn't believe God would hear, and placed them in a burlap sack. She'd walked 2 miles into the desert, to the old abandoned barn on the trail to Silver Ridge, and left them there. Someone would find them, she told herself. Someone with means, with kindness, with the ability to give them what she couldn't. And if no one found them, well, perhaps that was God's mercy too. Better a quick death in the desert than slow starvation in her arms. She tucked a small piece of blue calico, the last remnant of the dress her mother had made her before everything fell apart, into the sack with them. Then Catherine Miller had walked away from her children, each step feeling like dying, and hadn't looked back. James stared at the 3 babies and felt time collapse. 2 days' ride to Redemption Creek. 2 days these infants didn't have. The smallest one, he could hold her in one hand, was barely moving. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. The other two were stronger, but not by much. They needed water, milk, warmth, and medical care. They needed all of it now. His mind raced through options, each one bleaker than the last. He could ride hard for town, but the babies would die before he made it halfway. He could stay here and hope someone else came along, but this trail saw maybe one traveler a week. He looked at his horse, at his canteen, at the ruins of the barn. Then he looked at the babies again and saw his son's face. The child he'd never gotten to hold, never gotten to save. "Not this time," he said aloud. "Not this time." James tore his shirt into strips, creating makeshift swaddling. He dribbled water from his canteen onto his finger and let each baby suck the moisture. The littlest one, he started calling her Grace in his mind, barely responded. He rubbed her chest gently, the way he'd seen the doctor do once with a newborn calf. "Come on, little one. Fight." Then he remembered. 3 miles back, he'd passed an abandoned homestead. There'd been a well, and he'd seen goat tracks in the dust. Wild goats sometimes sheltered in abandoned buildings. If he could find them, if he could get milk. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. James fashioned a sling from his saddlebag, nestled the 3 babies against his chest, and rode like the devil himself was chasing him. The survival journey that followed would haunt James Thornton's dreams for the rest of his life. But not with nightmares, with wonder. He found the homestead as the sun began its descent, painting the sky blood red. And there, in the collapsed barn, were 4 wild goats. It took him an hour of patient stalking to corner a nursing doe, another 30 minutes to calm her enough to milk her into his tin cup. The babies drank desperately, their tiny hands grasping at air. He named them that night, by the light of a small fire. Grace, the smallest, who'd nearly slipped away. Faith, the middle child, who had his Sarah's nose. And Hope, the largest, who'd been the one to cry "Mama" and save them all. "You're fighters," he told them, his voice rough with emotion. "All 3 of you, just like you need to be." The first close call came at dawn. James woke to find a diamondback rattlesnake coiled 2 feet from where the babies slept. His hand moved with the speed of old instinct, drawing his knife and pinning the snake's head in one fluid motion. His heart didn't stop pounding for an hour. The second came that afternoon, when storm clouds rolled in with terrifying speed. James barely got the babies sheltered under an overhang before the sky opened up. Rain turned to hail, chunks of ice the size of walnuts hammering the earth. He curled his body around the infants, feeling the hail bruise his back, and prayed to a God he'd stopped believing in. The third close call nearly broke him. On the second night, Grace stopped breathing. Just stopped. James had been checking on them by firelight when he realized her tiny chest wasn't moving. Panic seized him. The same panic he'd felt watching Sarah slip away, helpless, useless. But this time, he wasn't helpless. He'd seen a doctor revive a drowning child once. James tilted Grace's head back, covered her nose and mouth with his own, and breathed the gentlest breath he could manage. Once, twice, 3 times. Grace gasped, coughed, began to cry, the most beautiful sound James had ever heard. He held her against his chest and wept like he hadn't wept since Sarah's funeral. "Not today," he whispered. "Not today, little one." Something changed in James during those 2 days. The stone around his heart began to crack. When Hope gripped his finger with her entire tiny hand, he felt it. When Faith nuzzled against his chest, seeking warmth, he felt it. When Grace looked at him with dark, solemn eyes that seemed far too old for her hours-old face, he felt it. Love. Terrifying, overwhelming, impossible love. By the time Redemption Creek appeared on the horizon, James Thornton was no longer the man who'd found a sack by the side of the road. He was a father. The town erupted when he rode in with 3 babies strapped to his chest. People poured out of buildings, mouths agape. Doc Henderson, a gruff man in his 60s, took one look and started barking orders. Get them to my office, now! Someone boil water. Mrs. Chen, I need clean linens. The examination took an hour. James paced outside like an expectant father, which he supposed he was. Finally, Doc Henderson emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. "They'll live," he said simply. "Another day in that desert, and we'd be having a different conversation, but they'll live. You saved them, James." Sheriff Tom Briggs arrived as the sun set, his weathered face grave. "Need to ask you some questions, James, about where you found them." The story spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire. The miracle babies. 3 infants left to die, saved by a grieving widower. The town divided quickly. Some called for justice, for finding the monster who'd abandoned them. Others whispered about desperate circumstances, about how hard life could be for a woman alone. James listened to it all and said little. But he made one thing clear to Sheriff Briggs. "When we find the mother, I want to talk to her. Alone. Before anything else happens." The clue came from Martha Chen, who ran the general store. She'd been examining the torn cloth the babies had been wrapped in. "This calico," she said slowly. "I sold a dress in this pattern. Only made 3 of them. One went to the mayor's wife, one to a woman passing through, and one—" She paused, her face troubled. "One to Catherine Miller, about 6 months back, before her father threw her out." James felt something twist in his chest. He knew the name. Everyone in Redemption Creek knew Catherine Miller's story, the preacher's daughter who'd fallen from grace. He'd seen her once, months ago, walking with her head down while people whispered. He'd felt pity then. Now he felt something more complex. "Where is she?" he asked quietly. They found Catherine 3 days later, working as a scullery maid at the Broken Spoke Ranch, 15 miles outside town. She'd given a false name, but the ranch owner's wife had recognized her. When Sheriff Briggs and James rode up, Catherine was drawing water from the well. She looked up, saw them, and the bucket fell from her hands. She knew. James could see it in her eyes. The guilt, the grief, the terrible hope she was afraid to feel. "Are they—" Her voice cracked. "Are they dead?" James dismounted slowly. Up close, he could see how young she was, how broken. Her hands were raw from work. Her dress hung on a frame that had lost too much weight. But it was her eyes that struck him, the same dark, solemn eyes that Grace had. Mother and daughter marked by the same sorrow. "They're alive," James said. "All 3 of them." Catherine's legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees in the dust, a sound escaping her throat that was half sob, half prayer. "All 3, but I hoped someone would find one, maybe 2, but all 3? How?" "Goat's milk, stubbornness, and one of them, the littlest one," she called out, said Mama. "That's how I found them." Catherine looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Grace," she whispered. "I named her Grace, in my head, before I left them. Grace, faith, and hope. I thought if I named them, God might—" She couldn't finish. Sheriff Briggs cleared his throat. "Miss Miller, I need to ask you some questions. About the abandonment of 3 infants." "No," James interrupted. "Not yet. Give us a minute." The sheriff frowned but stepped back. James knelt in the dust beside Catherine. "Tell me," he said quietly. "Tell me why." And she did. The whole story poured out, the promises and betrayal, the pregnancy, her father's rejection, the town's cruelty, the impossible choice. "I had nothing," she said, her voice raw. "No money, no food, no way to feed even myself, let alone 3 babies. I thought if I left them where someone might find them, someone with means, they'd have a chance. And if no one found them—" She looked at him with eyes full of agony. "Is it worse to watch your children starve slowly in your arms, or to give them a quick death in the desert?" I couldn't decide. So I chose to hope. I chose to believe someone good would find them. James was quiet for a long moment. He thought about Sarah, about the child they'd lost, about the stone that had lived in his chest for 14 months. He thought about 2 days in the desert with 3 tiny lives depending on him, about Grace's hand gripping his finger, about the moment he'd breathed life back into her lungs. Someone did, he said finally. Someone did find them, and they're going to be fine. But they need their mother. Catherine shook her head violently. I can't. I have nothing to give them. I'm nothing. You're their mother, James said firmly. And I have a proposition for you. What James Thornton proposed that day shocked everyone in Redemption Creek. A marriage of convenience, a partnership. He had land, 200 acres and a sturdy homestead that had been too empty, too quiet since Sarah died. He had means, livestock, a future. What he didn't have was family. Catherine had 3 daughters but no way to care for them. Together they could give the girls what they needed. I'm not asking for love, James said carefully, standing in Doc Henderson's office with Catherine, the sheriff, and half the town council present. I'm asking for partnership. You raise the girls. I provide for them. We give them a home, a name, a chance. That's all. Catherine stared at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this? James looked at the 3 babies sleeping in a makeshift crib, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Because I held my son once, he said quietly. For about 5 minutes, before he stopped breathing. And I've spent 14 months wishing I could have those 5 minutes back. These girls, Grace, Faith, and Hope, they gave me 2 days. 2 days of being a father, and I'm not ready to give that up. Are you ready to give up being their mother? The town erupted in debate. Some called it scandalous. Others called it practical. The preacher, not Catherine's father, but the Methodist minister, called it Christian charity. In the end, it didn't matter what the town thought. Catherine looked at her daughters, then at James, and nodded. They were married 3 days later in a quiet ceremony. Catherine wore a borrowed dress. James wore his only suit, and Grace, Faith, and Hope slept through the entire thing, wrapped in new blankets donated by the church ladies who decided that, scandal or not, babies needed blankets. The first months were awkward. James and Catherine circled each other like wary animals, polite and distant. They divided the house. She took the bedroom with the girls. He took the loft. They divided the work. She cooked and cared for the babies. He worked the land and handled the livestock. They barely spoke beyond necessities. But slowly, something shifted. James would come in from the fields to find Catherine singing to the girls, her voice soft and sweet. Catherine would wake in the night to feed the babies and find James already there, rocking Grace back to sleep. They began to talk, small things at first, then deeper things. Catherine told him about her mother, who died when she was 12. James told her about Sarah, about the guilt he'd carried for not being able to save her. You can't save everyone, Catherine said one night, 6 months after the wedding. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset while the girls slept inside. But you saved them. You saved us. James looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the broken girl from the well, but a strong woman who'd survived impossible choices. We saved each other, he said. That night Hope said her first word. Not Mama this time, but Papa. She was looking right at James when she said it. Her face split in a gummy smile. Faith followed immediately, not wanting to be left out. And Grace, solemn, serious Grace, looked at James with those dark eyes and said both, Mama, Papa. Catherine started crying. James found himself crying too, and somewhere in that moment, the marriage of convenience became something else, something real. A year later, Redemption Creek had a new story to tell. Not about scandal or abandonment, but about the Thornton family. James, Catherine, and their 3 daughters who were growing like weeds. Grace, still the smallest, had become the family daredevil, climbing everything in sight. Faith was the peacemaker, always trying to share her toys. And Hope, the largest, had developed her father's stubborn streak and her mother's singing voice. The town had come around, mostly. Catherine's father never did. He died bitter and alone 2 years later. But the Methodist Church welcomed them. The general store gave them credit. And slowly, Catherine stopped flinching when people looked at her. On the second anniversary of the day James found the girls, the family rode out to the old abandoned barn. Catherine had never been back. She stood there, staring at the place where she'd made the worst decision of her life, and felt James's hand slip into hers. "I forgave you a long time ago," he said quietly. "Question is, have you forgiven yourself?" Catherine looked at her daughters, playing in the dust, laughing and alive and loved. "I'm trying," she said. "Every day I'm trying." "That's all any of us can do," James said. He pulled her close, and she leaned into him. This man who'd become her partner, her friend, and somewhere along the way, her love. Grace looked up from where she was examining a lizard. "Papa, Mama, look!" And they did. They looked at their daughter, their daughters, and saw not tragedy, but triumph. Not abandonment, but family. Not the end of a story, but the beginning. Because sometimes the family we choose is stronger than the one we're born into. Sometimes second chances come wrapped in burlap sacks on desert trails. And sometimes, in the harsh and unforgiving frontier, love grows in the most impossible places, if we're brave enough to let it. The Thornton family rode home as the sun set, 3 little girls chattering about lizards and clouds, and 2 adults who'd learned that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a future worth living for, together.